So allow me to introduce the panelists, and they'll talk a bit about their excellent book. Starting, of course, on my far left, many of you know Chris Johnson, who's the Freeman Chair for U.S.-China Studies here at CSIS, and has been spending a nice, strong day on bilateral relationships today, huh? I saw you with the Russia-China
earlier today.
So on to another. Then immediately closer is Haiyan Wang, who's the managing partner for the China-India Institute. Served as an adjunct professor of strategy at the NC Business School, and articles published in the Wall Street Journal, China Daily, and the Economic Times. Next is hopefully on the camera it shows that indeed it is a different person than me. It's not a double image.
I'm your twin brother.
Twin brother. Anil Gupta. Anil is the Michael Dingman Chair in Strategy and Globalization at the University of Maryland, and is ranked by Thinkers 50 as one of the world's 50 most influential living management thinkers. So it's great to have him on stage. And just immediately to my left is Girija Pande, who's the executive chairman of Apex Avalon Consulting based in Singapore. He was previously served as chairman of Asia Pacific for Tata Consultancy Services, and during his tenure received the Best CEO Award from the Singapore Human Resources Institute. So the three in the middle are the three co-authors of the book. So we'll let them tell you a bit about what they have in their findings, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
I'll just share my perspective on China and India and what got me interested in this book. Haiyan and I have written earlier. We wrote a book in 2009, Getting China and India Right. But that was actually really targeted at Western multinationals in terms of how to get your strategy for China and India right. And so that got us deeply analytically into India and China. What is the story? And it was interesting, an Indian and a Chinese writing together, because Haiyan made sure that I was honest about or objective about China, and I made sure that let's say we were objective about India. And we basically said that if one was to look at the China-India economic linkage not from the lens of 2014, but from the lens of 2020 or 2025, this would be a very big story. And so essentially what we said, okay, we know about this subject. We are among the most qualified people, perhaps, to write about this subject. So let's do it.
Indeed, if we were to look at far ahead, say 2030, and you say who would be the biggest economies in the world? Number one, China, and number two, probably U.S., and number three, possibly could be India. And neighbors, the fastest growing economies, the biggest economies. Can you imagine that business not being prospering? Can you imagine the trade ties, the investment ties, the people ties not being one of the most vibrant ones?
Well, looking at that vision, I remember when I first started working on India business affairs as a young staffer at the U.S.-India Business Council 16 years ago, there was still a question, who was going to win, India or China? They thought that it was very much a competition. And I remember in 2003 when former Prime Minister Vajpayee himself traveled to China and saw that indeed that question, at least in the interim, was a done question, that China had taken a step forward that India just couldn't match. But the question is, that is today, but it's still evolving right now. I'd ask Chris to tell us a bit, those of us that look at this view China better at industry, India better at services, natural complementarity, at least they're not messing around on each other's turf. Chris, a lot of discussion, though, about China moving towards a services economy, right, things like that. Can you give us a bit of a scene setter, too, and some of the things that are happening in China that might impact this?
Sure, absolutely. I think, actually, the reform process that they've laid out for themselves at last fall's third plenum really will shift the direction entirely of their economy. That manufacturing piece, because of demographics, because of markets that it's going to and so on, is declining. They know this. They know they have to transition to a service-based economy, and I think that will have real implications for their relationship with India. I actually think we're in a very interesting period, and I'm glad you guys chose to focus on sort of a 2020 or 2030 outlook, because right now, frankly, the dominant view, I think, in China is that they see the Indians as sort of discombobulated, well behind them, quite frankly, in terms of development, and not something to be all that concerned about, quite frankly. And with the recent election change in India, there's a lot of talk about what's Modi going to be like. I think there's an innate assumption on the Chinese side that he's dangerous from their perspective. and that he might in fact do some things with the economy that will allow multinational corporations to actually be able in negotiations with the Chinese to say, fine, we'll pick up and go to India, and and actually have it be something that's realistic, as opposed to sort of eliciting laughter from the Chinese side when that happens. So I think ultimately the direction they're headed will perhaps reduce a lot of that complementarity that exists now. But I think what's been very striking is over the years how we watched the Indian side, even when there were more moves, say, from the USG side, to try to at least enlist the Indians in some sort of a soft pincher movement, containment, whatever you want to call it, strategy. And the Indians have very deliberately and directly pushed back upon that. I think the Chinese have found that largely reassuring. Obviously, it's interesting to see what the Chinese are doing foreign policy-wise with their neighbors, especially over these territorial disputes on what you might call China's front door, the maritime space. There have been some interesting developments with the Indians along that front. I think there's a lot of strategic concern in the Indian communities that I speak to about what China may be doing there. There's no doubt that they're looking west as much as they're looking east with their foreign policy and economic policy in particular. So I think it's going to be a very dynamic space and something for us all to watch unfold. It'll be very interesting.
India has a massive trade deficit with China in goods trade right now. It's a huge component of their total trade deficit. India's put up some barriers that have, unintentionally, we presume, harmed American companies in their trade. Why is this trade deficit quite so high, and should India be worried about this, looking forward over this period?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say two things. So, number one, the trade deficit is not high, which I'm sure, the Indian media would find, kind of an appalling statement.
If you're tweeting about this, it's CSIS Live. Hashtag CSIS Live, because that one might get a little attention.
And I'll talk about why I say it's not high. And second, it's not an issue for India. Okay, which again is sort of counter to, I think, the mainstream point in India. And the reason why I say it's not high is because ultimately every country, you cannot expect trade to be balanced with every country. So yes, you want it balanced globally, but not with every country. And if you look at India's trade deficit of about $200 billion, of that, it's only 20% of the trade deficit that is with China. 70% of India's trade deficit pertains to energy. And so if India is concerned about its trade deficit, which it must be, the problem isn't China. The problem is energy imports. And so therefore, that's number one. Number two is that India's trade deficit today is 20% of its total trade deficit. But I looked at the figures. You go back to 2001, it was 30% of India's trade deficit, trade deficit with China. And over the entire decade, the trade deficit has hovered in the 25 plus minus trade deficit with China as a percentage of India's total trade deficit with the world. So it's not going up. Okay, so that's why I say it's not a big issue. In fact, also is that what China essentially sells to India, it's not toys and consumer goods. I mean, you see them, but you look at the billions of dollars, bulk of it is capital goods. And so, of course, if Chinese capital goods are 30% cheaper and they come with, low-cost financing, I would say more the merrier. If Chinese want to give it away for free, we should, say even better, because what China is doing is to accelerate India's infrastructure build-up, So
the Asian supply chain and the Asian manufacturing is all hubbed around China. The supply chain end there, they start there. India has not got into the Asian supply chain. So the Apple is taking various components and assembling them. It all happens in Asia without India entering into the picture. So that is because of the lack of Indian export manufacturing. As India is not an export manufacturer beyond a point, it can never get into the Asian supply chain. And as it can't get into Asian supply chain, it has landed in normally running trade deficits because we have to import that from Chinese. We don't export anything from India other than either raw materials or intermediates, not even that too much. So unless the Indian manufacturing is focused towards export manufacturing, you will continue to have what I call a structural deficit in this area.
And if you borrow a page from how China boosted its manufacturing capabilities in becoming an export powerhouse, And back in the early 80s, that's when China really leveraged the technology, the equipment, and later on the electronics components from not just Japan, but from Germany, from South Korea, from Taiwan, and making China a magnet for attracting all of these foreign technologies manufacturers to build the manufacturing capabilities in China. In the same way, fast forward today, China's labor cost is so far more expensive than that of India. I think the moment it has come for India to take this moment to be the magnet for attracting all of these foreign investors, not only from China, but from around the world, and build India's global competitiveness. And that's the end game.
Well, I think that touches very much on what you just said, and also the 2025 kind of time frame and arc. In the book, you suggest that India-China economic ties could be Asia's best-kept secret. How would you describe the relations between the two as compared to, say, each country's relations with other emerging economies, ASEAN, Latin America, Africa? How do you see that situation?
In terms of trade, China is India's largest trading partner. Of course, Anil talked about the trade deficit, and India is used to be China's 10th largest trading partner. In the last 2 years, trade has come down. Now it's probably the 12th. Relative to the other major trading partners of China's, the EU, the US, the ASEAN, China does 400 billion trade with ASEAN versus China does about 100 billion trade with Malaysia versus 65 billion with India. So relatively importance, China as a trading partner is far more important for India versus the other way around. But I think that, from a 2030 standpoint, the bigger story is really the story about FDI. That when China look at the big market or look at the multiple magnitude of opportunities, and China say, we are the largest market, we're the biggest resources, we're resources in terms of talent, and they look not too far in their neighbor, India. So it's not just a trade story. I think that the FDI story will become far more important to play out.
When I look at trade, or not just trade, but economic relationship between two countries, that it's driven not just by what's happening in terms of friction or lack of it or warmth in the linkages between the nodes, but just what's happening at the nodes themselves. So it's like reforms in China, or similarly what's happening in India. Now, if you look at India's GDP, roughly about 2 trillion, which is the same as the whole of ASEAN, slightly smaller than Brazil, same as the whole of Africa. So when the Chinese look around, of course, if you take out Japan or US or Europe, India is a very large economy. And here it's one economy as compared to 55 countries in Africa, or in 12 or 13 in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia and so on. So of course, if India basically the direction in which it was going in the last 5 years, so if India, essentially is on a glide path to history, then, of course, if Indian companies themselves, Tatas and others are not investing in India, why would the Chinese or the Americans or anybody else invest in India? But if the Indian economy, from where it is right now, begins actually, if Mr. Modi is like a Deng Xiaoping of India, then suddenly, in this, the relative interest of one node in the other node changes dramatically.
Chinese government see the India moment as opportunities, and then again, the Chinese government emphasized that the China dream is for peaceful development. Both countries are very poor, amongst the poorest. China needs to lift up the living standard. India needs to lift up living standards. So the China dream and the Indian dreams are essentially, in some way, common dreams, is to become richer, more prosperous. So that common pursuit of that common dream requires a peaceful coexistence, and then become a lot more pragmatic in finding ways to cooperate rather than just focus on the rivalry part. I think that message is far more dominant in the Chinese media, in the thinkings of the Chinese government than, say, rivalry. Perhaps because of that vision that Premier Li first foreign visit was to India. The first foreign leaders to congratulate Modi's becoming prime minister is the Chinese prime minister, and inviting Modi to visit inviting President Xi to visit India perhaps later this year. All of this, I think, reflects that vision of emphasizing that common dream. So.
Yeah. Also, kind of to look at, as you said, from the bigger government to government relationship perspective, is that unlike, say, the China-Japan relationship, there is much less emotional baggage in the China-India relationship. And also, because of the way both sides have managed the border issue for the last 30 years, as we say in the book, the guns have been silent. And that and leaders on both sides have explicitly stated that we don't know if in our generation we will find a solution, but we will find a peaceful solution, which is not what the leaders say of China and Japan are saying, and so that just to basically say that there is much less emotional baggage in the China-India relationship. I don't think that the relationship will become warm and fuzzy anytime soon, but at the same time, it would be essentially a case of economic pragmatism. In fact, I predict it's hard to say about FTA with the U.S., but FTA with China, India, China, I put the probability in the next, at least 5 years, maybe longer, as 0. And I would hope and I assume that when China's foreign minister, Mr. Wang Yi, was in India last 3 days, that they spent 90% of the time talking about investment rather than trade issues, because that's where the real juice, I think, is.
Well, with that, I think I'm going to conclude the formal part here. I think as we started off with, we look at this relationship oftentimes as the contentiousness, and in fact, sometimes encouraging that to some extent. We can only talk about India and get people's interest if we talk about it as counterweight to China, and I suppose there's a counter argument to be made there too. But this is a much more positive way to look at the relationship, and I think too, we look at the contentiousness as an inside the Beltway and certainly inside CSIS and other type buildings. But if you're inside companies in China and India, I'm sure the two of them are focusing a lot on the messages that these three brought to us today, and then included in the book that's available just outside this office. So I hope everybody will join me in thanking our panelists, and also to Pranay from the Embassy of India for joining us.